Good morning, Mark. So I don't know if we got the good to see you. Hi, Chris. Yeah, it's great to have you. I've been looking forward to it. She will be. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Good morning. Okay. We're going to get started now. It's like getting a large class to settle down. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Eve Stern, Director of URI's Center for the Humanities, and I'm so pleased to see so many people with us on this lovely October morning. I want to extend a special welcome to our alumni and community members who are joining us today. In a few minutes, you'll be hearing from our distinguished panelists, Professors Kathy DeCesare and Rod Mather from URI's Department of History, Professor Chris Bovy, Chair of URI's Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and our special guest, Lorén Spears, Executive Director of the Tomaquag Museum, which will be moving from Exeter to URI in a couple of years, which is really exciting. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce URI's new president, Marc Parlange, who will say a few words. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Warm welcome to the University of Rhode Island today. It's great to see you all. I'd like to begin, as we do at the University of Rhode Island, paying tribute and recognizing that we are on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Narragansett First Nation. It's really a thrill to be able to have this event. In fact, when I was still in Australia, I remember signing up for it thinking with great enthusiasm, wow, October seems like a long way away, but it's something that, and I'm glad that the weather cooperated. One wasn't sure what would happen in October. But it is very important to understand where we are, the place we are, and I just want to really thank our colleagues in history, the humanities, archaeology. It's so important. I believe that it is really fundamental for our student community, but for our staff and faculty to understand, and then obviously for our alumni and for our community members. And so I'm just thrilled to be able to participate and listen and learn. And I think that's why we are all here, is to be able to hear from colleagues who have been thinking long and hard and have lived lives here in Narragansett. So I'm just delighted to welcome you all, and it's really my pleasure now to present Lorén Spears, who, as you've just heard, is the director of the museum, but has also been quite a great friend, an alumni of the university, and supporter of our students at this university and community. So Lorén, thank you.
Thank you so much, President Parlange, and thank you everyone else. I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to greet you in my language and do an opening blessing in my language. So. Askawi Kwasin, Natasuis Makasini Pashao at Narragansett, Natasuis Lorén Spears at Englishat, Ni Narragansett Nahantek. Kanupiam Wuchi ni Tampawag ka ni Tanksawag at Aki at Narragansett. So what I said to you in my greeting is, hello, I'm Lorén Spears, and my traditional name is Makasini Pashao. I am Narragansett Niantic, and welcome to my friends and family to the homelands of the Narragansett people. Katabatash Katantawa Wuchi Wami Nawia Nakan Wini Tiawank. Katabatash Katantawa Wuchi Wini Kisak. Katabatash Katantawa Wuchi Nipawus Ka Matakwasag. Katabatash Katantawa Wuchi Kitan. Katabatash Katantawa Wuchi Namas Tapan Tunapasag Nikekiwag Ka Ashankwag. Katabatash Katantawa Wuchi Wita. Katabatash Katantawa Wuchi Wamsakuk Napeshawag, Katabatash Katantawa Wuchi Peshamwak, Katabatash Katantawa Wuchi Sokanun Kacha Usha Nyampaog Ka Wayupai, Nashbi Mishatashan Pianwag Chisatau, Kakantamu Wami Sakwan Kisakwan Takwanik Ka Paponi Pashao Nashbi Wunitiawank, Katabatash Katantwa Wuchi Wami Panam Tamwe, Tiang Tuagonash, Katabatash Katantwa Wuchi Wami Katan Kamwam Ut Anantam Mahug Ka Nashawank, Kanashuwanku Kachisamai Unkonginawan, Kakantamwu Kanau Aquane Kapashankoni, Nanipan Mawi Ut Watu Antam Nukasaki, Katabatash Katantawa Wuchi Wami Waman Unisiniat Nukasaki, Katabatash Namanatuman Wuchi Wami Wanaki Tiawank Ni Wayan Nakan, Katabatash Wuchi Wami Kamaguanash Namanatum Ninaj. And so in the blessing, what I said to you is welcome to all my friends and relatives to the homelands of the Narragansett Nation. Thank you, Creator, for all the beauty that surrounds us. Thank you, Creator, for this beautiful day. Thank you for the sun and the clouds and for the ocean. Thank you for the animals, like the fish, the turtles, the otters, the whales, the clams and the lobster, and the forest, and all the birds, the hawks, the eagles, the geese. Thank you, Creator, for all animals, bears, rabbits, deer. Thank you, Creator, for the rain, the thunder, the lightning, and the winds. With a storm comes a cleansing. We wish all the seasons, spring, summer, and fall, to burst forth with beauty. Thank you, Creator, for all living things. Thank you for our ancestors, those who suffered, mind, body, and spirit. Their spirits wash over us. We wish for peace in the future. We stand together to care for and protect Mother Earth, and we thank the Creator for all the beauty that surrounds us. We thank the Creator for all the gifts and the knowledge of learning. Ninaj, or Amen. So with that, I also would like to add a few words in land acknowledgement. As I welcome you and bless this day, I must acknowledge the 400 years of conquest, colonization, genocide, land dispossession, enslavement, forced assimilation, detribalization, and erasure of the Narragansett and other indigenous nations of the Americas. I must also acknowledge the bravery, resilience, perseverance, and adaptability of our ancestors who ensured our continuation, passing forth our traditional ecological knowledge, language, history, and culture, while contributing to the creation of this colony, state, and country. There is no U.S. history without Indigenous peoples' history, and there is no Rhode Island history without Narragansett, Niantic, and other Indigenous peoples' history. This is our homeland since time immemorial. We are still here. May we always remember we are the land. What we do to the land, we do to ourselves. We must care for Mother Earth to ensure our future generations. A land acknowledgement is just the beginning and must be followed by actions, and that is why we at Tomaquag Museum established the Indigenous Empowerment Network and represent the museum's exhibits and programs from a first-person perspective, and why we partner with a multitude, probably 75 to 100 different organizations each year, to ensure our voice is heard and that we can help support educating others. And that's why we partner with the University of Rhode Island in so many ways. So katabatash akwane ka nuanantam. So thanks, peace, and blessings.
All right, thank you. Just to have a few more thank yous, I just want to thank Eve and the Center for the Humanities for inviting us to present and give it an opportunity to begin a discussion on memorialization and commemoration on campus. I also want to thank Dr. Timothy Ives, who's the Rhode Island State Archaeologist, for supporting our work and this project as part of Rhode Island Archaeology Month. And finally, I just wanted to thank all of you for coming out on a Saturday morning. We really appreciate the interest. So I'm going to give a brief overview of our project and then tell you a little bit about how it started and what you're going to hear about today. So the idea for this project came in 2017 at the 125th anniversary of the University of Rhode Island. So some of you might have been there at some of those wonderful events that were held to commemorate that important anniversary. But as archaeologists and historians, we realized that this land had a much deeper past, much deeper history. So we created a walking tour for the Rhode Island Archaeology Month in October 2019, and we invited Lorén to join us so that we could include that Indigenous perspective on the URI campus land. Here's a photo of us, their team, on that beautiful October day. We initially focused on the history of the university, and especially the Narragansett ties to this land, because this history is really invisible, I think, to most members of our community. It's important to note that there's all sorts of other stories that could be uncovered and highlighted, including the African American experience, the civil rights, and the women's movements. So we created a one-credit class in fall 19, kind of an enrichment course for undergraduates to focus on this history of the campus land. And we also did an alumni version of that course last spring. We're working on turning that into a 3-credit course. So our idea is that the students will help us do the research and fill in some of the gaps to these other important periods of time and help build out that content more. So that's sort of where we are on the overall project. So rather than try to give a comprehensive history today, we're going to draw on these themes of memorialization and commemoration and really highlight what is visible, what's invisible, what's remembered, what's not remembered, and what's memorialized and not memorialized on this land. I'm going to start by giving a little background on the archaeology and the ancestral Narragansett use of this land. Then Rod and Kathy will talk about the URI campus, focusing on 3 issues or locations: the Niles burial ground, the Watson House, and the URI built landscape. And Lorén is going to kind of jump in at various points and give her perspective on these issues. So it'll hopefully be more of a discussion than just straight lectures. So just a little bit overview of archaeology. So archaeology is one way that we know about the past. So we systematically excavate objects, we record their context, and we analyze them. And the power of archaeology is really in providing information about people and activities that is left out of written records. So the objects we recover are tangible reminders of the people who once lived here. In recent years, there's been a lot of effort to combine the science of archaeology with traditional indigenous knowledge. So I'm going to focus sort of on that science part, on the archaeology, and then Lorén will come up and talk about those cultural traditions. First, I'm just going to give a little environmental context. So it's important to mention that Rhode Island has very rocky soil. So this is not a surprise to any of you who have tried to dig a hole around here. Lots of rocks. And we have, this is very short, abbreviated history here, but we have glaciers to thank for this. So during the last ice age, which lasted until about 11,000 years ago, huge ice sheets covered and transformed this region. So those glaciers transported vast amounts of soil and rock, which were deposited here as that ice retreated. So many portions of the upper campus were very rocky prior to the establishment of the university. So here's an example, a picture of the Watson House, which we're going to talk about soon, but you can see all those huge boulders and rocks that were cleared at one point in time as the campus got started. However, at the base of the hill, near the Plains Road parking lot, is a sandy outwash plain with well-drained soils and fewer rocks, so really great for agriculture. So as you walk downhill, you start to get fewer rocks and better soil. So soil is important, of course, for people, but also water. So today, URI manages and engineers the natural flow of water and stormwater on campus through a series of drains and pipes and culverts. But before the construction of the URI campus, there were 2 healthy streams that ran across this land, Whitehorn Creek and Whitehorn Brook, which can be seen in this 1942 topographic map. One branch of the brook feeds into the Chepuxet River. So here I have highlighted for you so you can see them a little better. So given the fertile soils and waterways, it's not surprising that ancestral Narragansett artifacts or cultural objects are most abundant in the low-lying areas. We do have evidence other places on campus for sure, but the greatest amount of evidence is in that low area. This area would have been wooded prior to European contact and would have been an ideal place for foraging. And we know that the indigenous people were a permanent presence on this landscape for thousands of years. So here's a picture of retired professor of anthropology, Dr. Bill Turnbaugh. In the 1970s, he did some archaeological work on campus. Here's a part of his survey map that he did. So he'd take students involved in this research at certain points. But more recently, most of the work that has been done on campus has been done by the Public Archaeology Laboratory. And I just want to give a shout out to them and thank them for especially sharing a lot of the images that I'm going to show with you today. They were hired to investigate the archaeology prior to the construction of things like the Plains Road parking lot that you see in this photo. So that work is required as part of the National Historic Preservation Act and the Rhode Island Antiquities Act, and was completed in consultation with the Narragansett tribe and the Rhode Island State Historic Preservation Office. In short, if you're on state land and you have to build something, you need to have archaeologists come in and make sure you're not going to disturb anything. So, what was found here? Well, lots and lots of objects, and many were located on the ground surface in some of the fields, including white quartz and green argillite flakes. Flakes are just waste material from making stone tools, like you see in the bottom right here. And then, of course, the tools themselves, projectile points, scrapers, knives were also found. And just want to mention a little bit about this stone. So the argillite you can see in the upper right, it's kind of a greenish stone. This probably originated from a source on Conquest Island or present-day Jamestown in Narragansett Bay. And then you also see here quartz. The Pale archaeologists thought the quartz tools were likely made from cobbles locally available in the soil and in the stream beds. And most of those quartz flakes were smaller than 1 centimeter or smaller, which suggests that people were perhaps making the rough part of the point somewhere else, and then coming and finishing the tools or resharpening them here. Because a lot of those flakes are very tiny. In addition to all these cultural objects, they found what we call features. So features are things like pits and hearths. You can see a picture of one here from the top before it was excavated, and then cross-section. These had been truncated by centuries of plowing. So in most cases, the plow destroys that upper level, so it was really the bottoms of these features that were recovered during this work. So the Pale archaeologists worked with a backhoe operator who actually, you don't usually see backhoes in archaeology, but that upper portion was disturbed. They stripped that off, and then when they got down to the intact surface, the Pale archaeologists very carefully exposed those features and recovered quite a number of them. So here's some of the things that they found in those features. A lot of charcoal, which is burnt wood, and they hypothesized that some of the identified features might have been used for things like slow cooking of foods, hide smoking, or smudge pits to try to repel insects. One hearth feature that Bill Turnbaugh excavated contained fire-cracked rocks, approximately 100 large and small quartz flakes, 2 projectile points, small mammal bone fragments, and carbonized nutshells, including hickory. And because of those hickory nuts, he surmised that the site was probably used in the fall months. So from radiocarbon dating and also the style of artifacts, we know that this area was most heavily occupied between about 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, although we certainly have evidence later in time as well. And archaeology helps to make this visible. Interestingly, the archaeology evidence supports what the Narragansett people already knew, that the oral traditions tell of a village located on or near campus. So today, the remains of ancestral Narragansett sites are invisible to most members of the university community, I think, but the Narragansett people, of course, are still here, living and working on this land. So I'm going to turn it over to Lorén to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Chris. Phenomenal. So one of the things that came to my mind right now was thinking about, and it's slightly off campus, the Site 110 Salt Pond site that has been excavated in the last 20 years, that some of you may have seen the film Woven in Time. If you haven't, it comes up on PBS periodically. And what it made me think about is when we were talking about the Ice Age, which has been common archaeological perspective of the space, but also, David Robinson, thank you. He did some work here at the university in conjoined with the Narragansett Historic Preservation Office and Narragansett students who actually did deep sea diving and archaeology, and that helped to prove that the time frame goes farther back. So I think sometimes when we look at what we think of the land as the United States today or North America today, isn't actually where all the land once was. Ice age pushes the water up as the ice recedes, so the land that was out farther in what we would think of as the Atlantic Ocean next to Block Island or what have you, was once land, and that our people were there. And that's how, when we say we've been here since time immemorial, and then even in the documentation it's going backwards in time, to me 20,000 years that's a norm now of what's being said of how many years the Narragansett people have been in these lands. So I just like to bring that up and just kind of put context on that, because the other thing that I like to put context on, because it's common mythology about the Bering Strait, and most archaeologists that I speak with today debunk even that theory themselves. And then also I like to say that archaeology is a science, and so sometimes they have to, in order to say something, they have to prove it. And if they can't prove it, then they can't say it. But that doesn't mean it's not a truth. And the example that I'll use is in the Salt Pond site. I worked with Jay Waller and did some presentations here at URI at the Bay campus. And one of the conversations was around corn. Corn is extremely important to the Narragansett people. It's symbolic spiritually, socially, culturally. It's a food, it's edible, it's medicinal, it's spiritual, it's useful, using the husks for various household items and toys for children and such, that it was ridiculous to us that in the 70s, give or take, archaeologists were saying we didn't eat corn. And we're like, what are they talking about? Of course we ate corn. But they couldn't prove it, so they couldn't say it, I guess. I don't know how come they could say we couldn't when they couldn't prove it, but that's another whole story. So in the Salt Pond sites, they found huge caches of corn underground. So a cache is a pit lined with mats, and here's all that historic flint corn in there. And so until they did the Salt Pond site excavation, archaeologists were saying we didn't eat corn, or that we learned it somewhere else. I don't know. It was the oddest thing to me. So when I talk about marrying oral history with the sciences of academia, history, archaeology, anthropology, sometimes our communities know things that the academic experts may not know based on our oral tradition and our continuation. And so I just wanted to bring those couple of things up. The other thing, since we're talking about decolonizing, one of the things that we do as a museum is we're decolonizing museums, helping other mainstream museums decolonize their practices. But a museum structure itself is a colonial construct. And so we have no choice but to decolonize that as Indigenous people leading a museum. And so one of the things that we do is we changed a lot of the nomenclature. So for example, words like object and artifact we call belongings. And belongings mean it's connected to a people, a place, a community. It's being used by, it's been made by, it's been passed along to people, humans. And it's connected to it. It's not just a thing over here disconnected. It's connected. It's in relationship with the people. And so that's one of the things that we are trying to do. I think the only other thing I really wanted to say in this space was just how happy I am that the university has been so open to creating partnerships and relationships with the Native community, with Tomaquag Museum, to support Native students, to increase and are making initiatives to increase Native students on campus with the amazing tuition waiver specifically for Narragansett students, but also encouraging all Native students to come to the university, to also having conversations with faculty and leadership like President Palange around increasing the ideas around museum studies programs, as well as potentially in the future a Native studies program here at the university. And then most importantly, supporting the Native students and helping and support the Nassau students. And I have here another Narragansett tribal elder, Wanda Hopkins, who serves as one of our tri-chairs on the Native American Advisory Committee here at the university, and also is staff here at the university. So thank you.
The URI campus is a cultural landscape. It's a built environment that represents our priorities and our prejudices, what we want to remember and what we want to forget. The construction of this cultural landscape is pregnant with conscious and subconscious meaning. For better or for worse, our campus is a built environment that reinforces messages and meaning. We're going to take a look at three aspects or locations of this cultural landscape, the Niles burial ground, the Watson House, and the URI campus, with a focus on the nature of land at a land-grant college and the naming of structures in our built-in landscape. In each of these three sections, we'll look at history and meaning, memory and memorialization. Kathy and I will provide some historical framework, and then we'll invite Lorén to come up and help us create a fuller picture. So our first stop is the Niles burial ground near the football stadium. This is a family burial plot associated with the Niles family that ran a plantation on the land currently occupied by the University of Rhode Island in the 18th century. It seems likely that the cemetery contains the remains of white, black, and indigenous people. The burial ground, quarter-acre in size, grass-covered, and enclosed with a grey fieldstone wall, is located on the south side of the Ryan Center. The fieldstones came from old farm walls that were on the university campus. There is a wooden gate at the southwest corner and a plaque that is supposed to convey some of the cemetery's historic significance. While the cemetery was known at the time that the state acquired the land for URI in 1888, that knowledge faded over the subsequent 100 years, and the cemetery became invisible in the landscape. So it was quite a surprise to diggers and workers when they put in a trench to wire the scoreboard at the south end of the Meade Stadium in 1986, when they unearthed the skeletal remains of 3 people. Preliminary investigations re-identified the cemetery, and analysis of the bones suggested that these particular individuals were of European descent. Just over a decade later, in 1999, the construction of the Ryan Center and improvements to the football field threatened to disturb the graves once more. So the university called in archaeologists from the Public Archaeology Lab to determine the location of the unmarked graves within the burial ground. The archaeological work exposed the tops of 36 suspected grave shafts orientated east-west. The work was not designed to expose the human remains, just to determine where the graves were located. So human remains appeared to be concentrated in 2 clusters, one to the northwest and the other to the southeast, separated by archaeological evidence of a fence. It's certainly possible that this then represents racial segregation of burials. The Niles burial ground is both visible and invisible. While thousands of people pass the burial plot each year, few know what it represents. Even fewer stop to think and reflect. The small plaque embedded on the outside of the west wall remains largely invisible to passers-by. It's fair to say that the plaque fails to acknowledge the full context of the burial ground and the historical processes in play.
So what does the Niles burial ground represent? It clearly has multiple meanings based on your perspective and your background. Oops, I got back. Oops, sorry. So it clearly has multiple meanings based on your perspective and on your background. For some, it might represent or symbolize English colonization. Euro-American settlements in this location gives us an opportunity to think about the impact of colonization. We can reflect upon how the English settlers migrated to this region, Narragansett Bay. They settled in small communities along the coast of Narragansett Bay. Roger Williams founded Providence in 1636, and the Aquidneck Island settlements were founded shortly thereafter. Settlers moved from the coast into the interior, and as they did, they controlled more land for farming and for the raising of livestock. In the mid-17th century, 1658 specifically, a number of Euro-American families took over a very large tract of land extending from present-day North Kingstown all the way to Narragansett. This was called the Pettisquamscot Purchase. There we go. The Niles burial ground might represent this land acquisition where we are today. The English brought with them their understanding of individual property ownership. This understanding of land was very different from indigenous perspective. For the English, land was a source of wealth and for sustenance. The early settlers believed that there was an abundance of land. When they arrived, technical difficulties here. Okay. When they arrived here, they needed to legally justify seizing the land. Many knew enough about English law to know that they needed proof or evidence of ownership. Land evidence records, such as written deeds, accentuate the visibility and continuity of Euro-American ownership. The Niles burial ground might represent or symbolize slavery and the plantation economy. In the 17th century, Euro-American families in South Kingstown created an elite society. They were called the Narragansett planters, and their farms were called plantations. Oops. On these fertile lands, the planters grew crops and raised livestock for sustenance and for export. One example was a horse. It was named the Narragansett Pacer, and it remained a very profitable export well into the 19th century. European colonists used servants and enslaved people of indigenous and African descent in much higher numbers in South Kingstown compared with all other parts of Rhode Island except Newport. So South Kingstown was the epicenter of plantation slavery in Rhode Island, and Rhode Island was the center of slavery and the slave trade in New England. We know that in 1775, Silas Niles II controlled 10 indigenous enslaved peoples and 6 enslaved people of African descent. This number was higher than his grandfather. The Niles family burial ground represents this legacy of slavery, the plantation economy, and illegitimate land acquisitions in South County. The Niles burial ground might also represent or symbolize war. South Kingstown was a battleground during King Philip's War between 1675 and 1676. It was the location of the Great Swamp Massacre in December of 1675. Over 300 Narragansett people, mostly women and children, were shot or burned alive in what can only be described today as a war crime. Oops. The year before King Philip's War in 1674, the town of South Kingstown incorporated. The war was a result of aggressive and contentious settlement patterns and the outright theft of indigenous land. The English used religion to justify their actions of total warfare, genocide, and slavery. Perhaps the Niles burial ground represents continued attempts to erase indigenous peoples. The way it is memorialized, remembered, and at the same time not remembered reflects our collective attitudes. Lorén, I invite you to say a few words.
So the first thing I'm going to do is sing a song. Forgot my rattle in the car, but we'll do without. When I sing this song, I have to bring a particular elder ancestor into this space because she's the one that helped me to remember this song or learn it in a way that I could continue it forward. I knew it as a child, and when I had Nui Tuan school, we took a group of kids down to Washington, D.C., and she sang it there during a ceremony. And I said to her, I remember that song. Can you help me learn it? And so we sang it together several times through until I had it. And the words literally mean, we dwell here. You know weekend. You know weekend, you know weekend, we hey you know weekend ooks. Way ha, way ha, way way oh way ha, way ha, way ha, way oh way ha. You know weekend, you know weekend, we hey you know weekend nooks. Way ha, way ha, way oh way ha, way ha, way ha, way oh way ha. You know weekend, you know weekend, way hey you know weekend nooks. Way ha, way ha, way oh way ha, way ha, way ha, way oh way ha. You know weekend, you know weekend, way hey you know weekend nooks. We dwell here. 3 times through, once for the past, once for the present, and once for our future. So when I think about this space, when you think about that burial ground, it reminds us of the extreme differences in ideologies, and that until we unpack those differences in ideologies, we can't heal from the past. Things like who we memorialize, who we lift up and put on a pedestal. There's a book, I forget the author, you might be able to remember, Firsting and Lasting. So it's part of Conquest. The first of something, they're lifted up, and the last of something is memorialized in a way that puts them in the past and as being no more. And a lot of the words that we use today focus in on that paradigm because it continues and persists conquest and the ideas around conquest. You know, Roger Williams, certainly from a colonial construct, is a first, right? But what we forget to tell is that without the Narragansett people, he would never have been successful. When he came here and quote unquote founded Providence, he was cast out of Massachusetts and taken in by the Narragansett, who were the sovereign nation of that space and time. They could have said no. They could have kicked him out. They could have not allowed him to utilize the land, keywords there, because he was under, even if you read in his own documentation early on, he understands that he's on the sovereign lands of the Narragansett people. It isn't until after King Philip's War that that really breaks that completely apart. So we have to think about those terms and the words that we use, like the Petasquamsket Purchase. We all know that was just another big theft, as you stated. It's really important, as we're talking about the University of Rhode Island, that we really clearly understand that this is stolen land, that it is a land grant institution, and the structure of the Morrill Act was to steal land from indigenous populations, and sometimes actually use lands and steal lands westward to use that fund to, quote unquote, purchase lands in other places, and another way of dispossessing of us the land. So it's all part of the tenets of conquest. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but these are my versions of the tenets of conquest. It's greed for the land and the resources. Masses follow the people with power that actually have the greed. They just come because they're trying to survive, the masses. Power, political power, military power, economic power, weaponry power, all the systems and structures of power. Entitlement technically is a type of power, but I put it by itself because it's so powerful. It's that notion that in your own head that you believe that you have the right. I like to use Christopher Columbus as that example because of the power of the King and Queen of Spain, he believed he had the right to go to new places, stick a flag in the ground, and claim it for them. That's entitlement. Fear and hate, breeding fear and promoting hate. I use our own, and I say our, because we live in this country too. We're dual citizens, citizens of our indigenous nation as well as the United States of America. Merciless Indian savages whose known rules of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Declaration of Independence. Despite the fact that we fought in that war, and in many cases, not all places in the colony, but in many places, including up in this area, we were fighting with the colonists. The idea of throwing that yoke of tyranny off, thinking that maybe that would improve circumstances. Censorship, and that's what we're talking about today. Memorializing, commemorating has been part of the erasure of indigenous people. There's also been words like, and I'm coming back to you with Narragansett planter and Narragansett pacer. Did you notice the dispossession of our name so that it no longer was connected to indigenous people, but now to the white plantation owners? Did you see the dispossession that just took place in that? Really important, because it happened all over this place on how our own words got taken away from us and then used to support the supremacy that was going on, and displace us and dispossess us of our land and our lifeways. So I think that the last thing is assimilation in the conquest strategy, is to forcibly assimilate you into this other way of life that erases you, intends to erase you completely by changing your language, your spirituality, your life ways, your homes, by taking your children forcibly from your communities through boarding schools. By the way, we'll be hosting the Away from Home, the American Indian Boarding School Experience. Tomaquag Museum is the host organization, but we're partnered with the university on the location. It'll be on Upper College Road at the Old University Club from November 10th to January 7th. I'll put a flyer out there and maybe people can snap a picture because I don't think I have more than one or two with me. But that's education, here we are in an educational institution. I have 2 degrees in education, so I think education is really important, but you have to understand that education was a weapon against our children and against our families and against our communities and was part of conquest. And so today, we're imploring educational institutions to do better, to allow Indigenous children to feel good about who they are, to understand their own history and culture, and be part and proud of their communities, which they are within their own community, but not necessarily in their educational structures, K-12 through college, to uplift that by Native Studies programs and other opportunities that are beneficial for everyone, but especially so for our students. I think I will stop there, but I think these are just really, really powerful structures about conquest, and how wonderfully that you represented that in thinking about this Niles burial ground and how erased the people that reside there are. So that hopefully when you go by there today, we're talking here because of COVID and we can't get so close to have a talk while we're out, but just to have that reverence in your heart when you go by there and thinking about the sacrifices those people made to have us all be here today in different kinds of ways. Am I supposed to go right into what else I'm saying? Or thank you. I got lost in it, so I don't want to confuse us all in our schedule.
Our second stop is the Oliver Watson farmhouse. This is the only standing structure built that predates the establishment of URI. The house that you see today was built in 1796 by Jeremiah Carpenter, a tenant farmer. It sits atop an earlier 18th century house belonging to the Niles family. In fact, the older 18th century foundation is still visible on the west side of the house, although we don't know for sure whether the enslaved peoples lived in the current Watson farmhouse in the 18th century. They certainly worked the land. Over the years, the house and the lands were sold several times. Oliver Watson purchased the property in 1844. The family held on to it until 1888, when Watson heirs Mary Teft and Phoebe Watson sold the land to the state of Rhode Island for what would become the University of Rhode Island. Like the Niles burial ground, the Watson house is both visible and invisible. Thousands pass by it every year, but few members of our community consider what it represents. Archaeology has made the Watson house a little bit more visible. Bill Turnbar and his students conducted surface collections and small-scale excavations in the Watson house yard in the 1970s and the early 1980s, with the primary goal of training his students in field and laboratory methods. Bricks and glass, broken dishes, nails, ash were commonly recovered. Personal items found included 2 cast iron toys, ceramic pipe stems, beads, a marble, a decorative pewter plaque, a gilded stick pinhead, and a penny. The archaeology students sorted and catalogued the ceramic pottery types that included earthenware, stoneware, pearlware, and porcelain, which were decorated in a variety of ways. Most of the ceramics were 19th century in origin, but a few were from the 18th century. Quartz projectile points were also found in the excavation units, testifying to the presence of Narragansett peoples occupying the same location at an earlier time. While few people consider the Watson house, fewer still are aware of the Spring house, the remains of which are 200 yards down the road from the Watson house, close to the close to the Roger Williams dorm complex. The structure is mostly buried, just the top is exposed. In the 19th century, the Spring house was part of the farm. Its function was to provide easy access to groundwater. People drew water from a stone-lined internal basin or sink. The structure itself provided protection from outside contaminants. In this picture from the 1880s, there's a seated woman visible, which gives an indication of the original height of the structure, perhaps 6 feet It was constructed of local fieldstone and integrated into an adjacent retaining wall. Local fieldstone was used extensively to create stone walls, to delineate farm fields and pastures here in Kingston and throughout New England. A remnant of the former stone wall system remains visible on the south side of the Watson Yard. Together, the Watson House, its stone wall, and spring house represented Euro-American efforts to manipulate, moderate, section off, and engineer the natural landscape, particularly with respect to stone and also water. As Chris mentioned, before the construction of the URI campus, two streams ran across this land, Whitehorn Creek and Whitehorn Brook. In the late 1940s, the streams that bisected the campus were still very much in their natural state. Today, Whitehorn Creek, which has its source under the Welcome Center parking lot, is culverted for most of its course. It does still emerge at 2 points, one just east of the library, and the other near the Roger Williams dorms. The way we manage and engineer and control the flow of water today sits in stark contrast to the way people used water when the land was a farm, and is certainly very different from the way indigenous people lived and worked with the landscape.
So what does the Watson House represent? Again, there are many meanings depending on your perspective and your background. For some, the Watson House might represent farming and the agricultural heritage of South Kingstown. South Kingstown families continued to farm well into the 19th century. They grew crops, raised livestock, including chickens, cows. Farming was hard, backbreaking work. Over generations, farmers are going to clear the forests and the rocks to make way for fields and pastures. Anglo-American patterns of inheritance continued. Land from the original Pettisquamskett Purchase was passed down generationally from one generation to another. Land continued to be valued as a source of wealth and of power. For some, the Watson House represents slavery. In South Kingstown, oops, I'm going too fast again. In South Kingstown and Rhode Island, the business of slavery continued well into the 18th century and early 19th centuries. Rhode Island passed a gradual emancipation law, but slavery still continued to persist. For some, the Watson House represents rural Rhode Island, wherein white Euro-American Protestants were a dominant force. Rural Rhode Islanders were able to wield significant power, political power, through land ownership. And they disproportionately were represented in the General Assembly at the state level. In the 19th and early into the 20th century, rural communities had more voting power than urban communities in Rhode Island. Voting was tied, of course, to race, gender, and land ownership. For some, I'm touching it too much. Okay. All right, I'm back on track. Okay. For some, the Watson House might symbolize a decline in agriculture as a way of life in South County. The ability to profit from farming declined in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Young people in southern Rhode Island left family farms and moved to urban areas like Providence in search of greater economic opportunities. The federal government's promotion of farming as a science within the mission of the land-grant college was an effort to make farming more productive once again. So for some, the Watson House represents the origin of the land-grant mission of the University of Rhode Island. For others, the Watson House might represent or symbolize a gendered space. In the late 19th century, women representing the Watson-Teft families deeded the farm to the state of Rhode Island. Over the years, the Watson House served many purposes, but most were connected to women at the university. Women's dorm, tea room, nursery school provide some examples of this. The house served as a laboratory for home economics majors. This was a historically female major at the University of Rhode Island. Most recently, the Watson House was a small museum depicting a 1780 to 1840 period farmhouse. Women's domestic responsibilities were heavily featured, including kitchen and hearth spaces, the bourning, which is the birthing room, and in the weaving spaces. We can return to this theme of gender and invisibility later on. We're going to revisit this later in the program. Oops. Some might envision a more visible and integrated role for the Watson House and the university. Perhaps after the new Tomaquag Museum is up and running, a second museum can be on the URI land, and together they could form the nexus of a new museum studies program. Lorén, I invite you to speak. You want me to, we can continue, sure? Okay, all right. All right.
Our final stop is a stop that reflects on the campus in general. And we're going to talk about land at a land-grant college and naming ways within the built environment. The origins of URI date back to the second half of the 19th century, when there was a concerted effort by the federal government to expand American higher education. The government wanted to make higher education more broadly available to Americans of average means and more practical, particularly for those families who earned a living from farming or from working in industry. It did this by providing funds for states to create colleges, specifically to teach agriculture and mechanical arts. These funds came from the sale or granting of federal land. And as you all know, schools that were funded in this way and founded in this way were called land-grant colleges, and URI is one of them. The whole scheme was the brainchild of Vermont Senator Justin Morrill. So the act of Congress in 1862 that created the new college, these new colleges bears his name. It's called the Morrill Act. There was a second Morrill Act in 1890, and in between them, an act that supported agricultural research stations called the Hatch Act. Initially, the money from the 1862 Morrill Act in Rhode Island went to Brown University. However, the money from the Hatch Act in 1887 was used to help purchase the Watson Farm here in Kingston and set up an agricultural school and research station. That set up a showdown between advocates for a fully fledged independent college in Kingston and those who wanted Brown to subsume the nascent college and research station down here. After a lot of wrangling, the independent college in Kingston plan won the day. On May 19th of 1892, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed legislation that created the Rhode Island College of Agriculture and Mechanical Arts. This history is marked in the cultural landscape in at least two ways. The first is by this Civil War era cannon called Old Ben Butler on the edge of the quad. On the evening that the Rhode Island General Assembly created the Rhode Island College of Agriculture and Mechanical Arts, students here in Kingston celebrated. They started ringing bells and raising flags, and then, having secured a Civil War cannon from a shady convicted murderer in Kingston Village called Captain George N. Butler, they started to fire it off. The cannon was named after Kenyon's friend and local political leader, Benjamin F. Butler, hence the name Old Ben Butler. Eventually, the students packed the gun so tightly with grass and sod and leaves that they exceeded the tensile strength of the gun, and it blew up, leaving it in its current condition. Today, many faculty, students, and staff likely see the cannon each day, but few know what it commemorates. The second way that the founding is memorialized is through the naming of the Justin S. Morrill Science Building, which was opened in 1966. But hidden beneath the language and the provisions of the Morrill Act, with its fine intentions, is a grimmer reality, a reality that is seldom recognized or remembered. The land upon which URI sits is Narragansett ancestral land. But the Rhode Island tribes were not the only ones to suffer, as Lorén has just suggested. The funds for the original URI land grant endowment, the money that had been transferred from Brown, came from the sale of Kickapoo lands in Kansas. The provisions of the Morrill Act stated that if federal land was not available in the home state, as was the case in Rhode Island, federal land could be claimed and sold in the new Western territories. So the money for the Rhode Island College of Agriculture and Mechanical Arts came from the sale of indigenous Kickapoo land in northeast Kansas, up near Atchison, in the top right-hand corner of this map. Indeed, the whole land grant program was built on the sale of federal lands, almost entirely taken from indigenous tribes through treaty, secession, or seizure. And few, if any, land grant colleges acknowledge this reality. In 1909, the Rhode Island College of Agriculture and Mechanical Arts was renamed Rhode Island State College, and in 1951, it took the name the University of Rhode Island.
So we're going to look at what is remembered or who is remembered in this built landscape here at URI. So the campus was built in phases over the past close to 130 years. In the first decades, granite structures were built starting on the northwest corner of the quad. They oriented westward and looked facing down the hill. The first buildings were Taft Experiment Station, completed in 1888, and College Hall, pictured on your screen, completed in 1890. Fire in January of 1895 destroyed College Hall. Luckily, very fortunately, there were no losses of life. Most of the students were in the village of Kingston attending church services. Davis Hall was quickly built from the ruins and on the foundation of the old College Hall. So Davis, Taft, and Lippett Halls, Lippett was completed in 1897, formed the first phase of what became eventually the quadrangle. The granite used for the construction of the original campus buildings was quarried on site. One quarry was located appropriately on Quarry Road near the hillside dorms today. John Washburn was the first principal of this school. His vision was to grow the campus around an open, very green space. He hired the very famous landscape architectural firm of Olmsted Brothers, the same firm known for the design of Central Park in New York City. Plans were finalized for the quad in 1898, and elm trees were planted around the perimeter. The construction of the buildings around the quad proceeded gradually. World War I and the Spanish, and most likely the Spanish flu, impacted construction rates. East, Ranger, Bliss, Washburn, and Edwards filled in on the perimeter of the quad between 1909 and 1929. With the exception of East, these first buildings were named for Rhode Island politicians and college administrators. This naming tradition represents the close connection between the state and the college, especially in the early years. In the 1930s, the campus expanded again with the construction of Green, Quinn, and Roosevelt Halls. Roosevelt Hall was the first brick building on campus, and it honored First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Green, Quinn, and Roosevelt were built as part of a large state and federal jobs program during the Great Depression. The naming of these buildings on the campus represents the close relationship between the college, the state, and the federal government, and especially the relationship between President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Rhode Island Governor and later Senator T.F. Green. Green and Quinn represent an important political change in Rhode Island. The bloodless or Green Revolution of 1935 altered the balance of power in the state from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. It is ironic that Quinn and Green, as leaders of an urban, ethnic, and Catholic Democratic Party, are memorialized here in granite in a traditionally rural, agricultural, Protestant, and Republican place. The campus grew tremendously in the post-war years. The GI Bill greatly increased enrollment. Right after the war, Quonset huts were used as temporary buildings all around campus. The 1950s through the 1970s saw massive changes in the built landscape at URI. Dorms, classroom buildings, lecture halls, laboratories were built all over campus on the north, south, east, and west sides. The tradition of naming buildings for prominent white male political leaders continued. Pastore, Fogarty, Chafee, Morell, and Pell, mostly, of course, Rhode Island politicians. Likewise, administrators, presidents, provosts, deans, influential faculty, and coaches were memorialized on the expanding campus. Carlotti, Ballantyne, Kirk, Keeney, Swan, White, Tucker, Carruthers are just some examples. Starting in the 1990s, new construction projects added to the campus, supporting the university and its land grant missions for the sea, urban, and land grant missions. The naming trends on these buildings shifted slightly during this time, from Rhode Island politicians now to financial benefactors and influential alumni. The built landscape and the naming traditions at URI have memorialized particular individuals. They have become part of URI's landscape, cultural landscape. When we look broadly at who is memorialized in the built landscape, clearly some people are represented and some are not. There is a specific demographic represented here tied to race and gender. Near the library on campus, there is a large stone monolith. It is the only visible acknowledgement on the main campus of the Narragansett people. Big shout out to GSO's recent naming of their new research vessel, the Narragansett Dawn in this case. But carved into this stone on this campus in the monolith is Nipenawatuim, which means I am of another language. Remember me, remember me. Opportunities exist to make visible the invisible, to recognize what is on the built landscape, to remember what lies beneath the land, to make seen the unseen, to remember the forgotten, to reflect upon the relevance of interdisciplinary research in the humanities and the social sciences, and to recognize indigenous oral traditions, history, anthropology, and archaeology as complementary ways of knowing to better understand our shared cultural landscape here at the University of Rhode Island. Lorén?
Thank you. Remember me. You know, it's a powerful phrase there, but oops, thanks. You forget you have them on. It's a powerful phrase, remember me, but it also speaks to the memorialization and commemoration, because it's something that's, you know, thousands of students walk by every day, faculty, staff, that probably don't even notice it, at all. And if they do notice it, they don't know what it really is talking about or what it's saying or what it's reflecting on. But it's also a continuation of conquest in the erasure of indigenous people and the memorialization that adds to the mythology that we're no longer here and that we're not part of this place. And so I think it's really important as we think about Remember Me, kind of to think about all the points in history. I'm going to pop back to slavery for just a moment, because there were a few things that we were talking about. There's the hidden history of slavery in Rhode Island in general, but there's the extremely hidden history of indigenous enslavement in Rhode Island, and those that were deported from Rhode Island to the islands off the Atlantic and in the Caribbean. So I think I want to mention a project that I'm partnered into, Stolen Relations at Brown University, and they have a database of indigenous slavery in the Americas, and it's in process, so eventually it'll be available to all researchers and such. But the idea that we came up with the name Stolen Relations because that's exactly what they are, and the reconnection that sometimes we have with people in Bermuda over the last 20 years and how that comes to be. But I also wanted to reflect on masonry that was depicted several times here on the campus. And my question is always, the owners of businesses are recognized and the workers in general are not recognized, but there were many indigenous people, African people, and other immigrant populations that were coming in that undoubtedly built this campus, and that are not, recognized in that way. I also want, as we're thinking about remembering, I want to remember our ancestors that were lost at Great Swamp, and the numbers vary, but it's one of the largest massacres documented in that colonial time period, and if not the largest. And it's often undertold, underrepresented, and misrepresented. And so I have to ensure that we think about, and when you drive by that site or go down to the monolith that's there, that you remember our ancestors and elders, but also realize that our people remember them daily, but definitely annually at the pilgrimage that we have every year in September. The actual date was December 19th, but it's a little chilly then, so we go in September as a community to acknowledge and remember the past, those of us here that are in the present, and our responsibility for the future generations. So that's really important to think about. I want to remember detribalization in the 1880s, when the state of Rhode Island really tried to formally and legally eradicate us, even though they couldn't get rid of all the people through genocide and displacement. They erased us legally. And it took 101 years for us to undo that injustice, which is why people like yourselves might show up at Tomaquag Museum and go, well, how come in every book I've ever read you didn't exist? I've actually had people ask me that. How come when it always said you weren't there, how did you just pop up now? We didn't just pop up now. We've always been here. The human beings were not eradicated from this place, but the formal entity was legally written out of existence. That's what detribalization means. And so it took all that time, and there are people like our elders and ancestors that fought during the Indian Reorganization Act time in the 30s, people like Ellis and Tarzan Brown, who made us visible by winning the Boston Marathon twice. You might have seen him in the paper in the last couple of days. People like, there's too many people to start naming people, I suppose, but that the times when we're trying to get the right to vote, we were talking about access and who gets the say, but look who's got the power. But indigenous people didn't become citizens of this country until 1924, and it was all the way to the 1950s until on paper we had the right to vote. There's still lots of barriers, and in the last several years there's been a really unpleasant political climate that's putting up more barriers for communities that are underrepresented, underheard in our communities. And it's part and parcel of conquest and settler colonialism. And it's the whole point is to erase us. So it's really important that we keep that idea of remembering, but to remember not only the people in our past and our history in our past, but to remember that we're here today, to remember that there's students on this campus that are Narragansett or from other indigenous nations, that people that you walk into the grocery store might be working there, might be the manager, might be the bag checker, doesn't matter what the position is. but that we're here, and that just like you, we've evolved over 400 years, and that we're not dressed like our ancestors on a daily basis. We're not speaking our language, unfortunately, on a daily basis in a fluent way. But we are connected to our culture. We're connected to our communities. We're connected to these lands. And so that's really important. You have another section? No, okay, just me. I'm supposed to push the button, I think. So in thinking about continuation and remembering that our people are here and that we're vibrant and that we contribute to the fabric of this state and this nation, we're so excited, if you haven't already seen it. This is the master plan image of the new Tomaquag Museum that, if everything continues to go as well as it's currently going in the planning and architectural and engineering work, as well as fund development kinds of constructs that are going on behind the scenes, we should be able to put a shovel to the ground in the fall of 2022 to have an opening of some sort of probably phase 1 in 2023. So it's very overwhelming and scary sounding when you say it out loud, because it's blazing on to 2022 really fast. But we have on our website, tomaquagmuseum.org, I did put some flyers over on the table if you didn't get them, but we put some of these things, and we'll be updating this and regularly to give people more information as we continue along the process. But we're really excited about the opportunity to empower the Indigenous community through our Indigenous Empowerment Program, which is already ongoing, but to actually have a whole center for that in this new site. So it has a main museum building, which of course will have exhibits. We're hoping when you come to Away From Home, it'll give you the idea of the level of exhibit design we're hoping to do when we have our new museum. It'll have an education center and the Indigenous Empowerment Center, which will have a lovely little eatery, as well as an artist in residency studio, and then the Archive Collections Research Center, or what we're going to call the Belongings Research Center when we're through. All of those things and many other things, our community is out there being very impactful. There's Native American restaurants, there's Native American businesses, there are Native American artists and performers and oral historians and educators and literally all walks of life. As you see with people like Deb Haaland being the Secretary of the Interior, we have served in all walks of life. There's been an Indigenous vice president. Look it up. If you notice, when our current vice president became, they were very careful to say first Black Asian woman. They couldn't say just the first person of color, okay, of a minority community, because that was an Indigenous person. So I guess the things that I would like to say last is that as we think about commemoration and memorialization, I really want us to think about continuation and the importance of that for all of us as humanity. And that leads me to these words, Nipa na kitiawang, water is life. And when we were looking at the Whitehorn Brook and how that goes, what I love is where the new museum is going to be. The Whitehorn Brook leads into the swamp over there, and the Chappaquiddick River is across the street. So you get the really more natural view of the brook than you do on the main campus, what you'll see today. But it comes back to the phrase that our elders tell us: what you do to the earth, you do to yourself. So care for the earth, and then you care for yourself. And so that's part of thinking about decolonizing the spaces and decolonizing the places. And to ensure all of our continuation, we have to uplift all people. I think there's a quote, something to the effect, injustice for one is injustice for all. And if we really take that to heart, we'll understand that it's all of our roles together to ensure that there's equity, inclusion in our world that we live in, and that there's respect and collaboration. And in some cases, there has to be restitution and reconciliation. And I think in the United States, we're not moving fast enough on that in relationship to the real genocide that took place here in the creation of this country. And it's really important that we move toward that. And that's how we can heal and move forward. And you know, it's going to happen probably bit by bit, and we're seeing it happen bit by bit. But I think all of us here can be part of that process and help that move along. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you, Katavatash, and thank you for listening to us and thinking about this campus in a new way.
Thank you to our panelists for a really stimulating conversation, and I hope many of you will be able to stay and join us for the walking tour. We'll be leaving from outside the main doors in the lobby. Tthank you again.
And maybe I'll say a couple words just about that. I just wanted to mention that we're not going to try to lecture to you while you were outside because there's too big of a group. So that's why we wanted you to be able to see these images and hear about it inside. And so hopefully you've got a brochure, and we're going to kind of walk together. We're going to do it backwards from the brochure, though. We're going to go downhill first, and then we'll have the uphill climb on the way back. And we're going to end it at Green Hall. And the last thing I want to mention is just that if you're interested in underwater archaeology, there's also on the quad today a sub that went down, submersible that went down to see the Titanic this summer. Professor Buxton from the history department is there, and so there's a little kind of display there, and you can talk to people and learn more about that if you're interested in underwater archaeology. So that's in the quad on our way back up. And we're there to answer questions, I should say that too. So I know we ran long, and I apologize for that, and we started a little late. So we thought we could answer questions while we're outside walking, if that sounds good. So just find us, and we'll meet outside in a little bit.